Hello, everyone. It's good to have us all together. For the local audience, thank you for braving that weather. We hope wherever the virtual audience is that they have a much nicer night than we do, although we're lucky to have just rain, not ice. It's a pleasure to have you here for the Tocqueville Lecture Series tonight. Just a little reminder about what we are. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is named after Alexis de Tocqueville. Born of the French aristocracy, Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that liberal ideas, which rejected both the antiquity of aristocracy and doubted the promises of the French Revolution, were the progression of history. Whether individuals fought for or against these ideals, he was convinced that equality of conditions is a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as they relate to other concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. Hosted on the campus of Jacksonville State University, these lectures are free and open to all that are interested. These lectures welcome the campus, community, and country to listen, think, reflect, and engage with each other. And perhaps I should add tonight, civilly. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by generous grants from the Jack Miller Center and Alabama Humanities Alliance. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its political and economic institutions, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions, which continue to animate our national life. The Alabama Humanities Alliance exists to provide context, build empathy, and make the state of Alabama a more vibrant place to live, all through the humanities. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Lee Trepanier. Sorry about that, Lee. Too much coffee at Starbucks here earlier. He is a local for us. He is the chair and professor of political science at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, where he teaches political philosophy, constitutional law, and American politics. He's a graduate of JSU. I know some of our criminal justice department will appreciate that we have LSU as but a graduate of Louisiana State University of the Tigers, and previously was a professor at Southern Utah University and Saginaw Valley State. He is the author and editor of several wonderful books and articles. We would be here at least 20 minutes if I tried to summarize all of them for you. So instead, let me summarize his research interest. He's interested in the thought of Eric Voegelin, liberalism and conservatism, politics and literature, religion and politics, democracy and education, and the teaching and learning of political science. He is also the editor of the Lexington book series on politics, literature, and film, and is an associate editor of Law and Liberty. I also hear he recently edited a book that examines the topics of disease and disasters from antiquity to COVID with political theory. And I hear the chapter about Hull House, which speaks to my pride as Chicagoan, is quite excellent, as well as great works on Thucydides, Locke, Bacon, short stories, and more. It's my pleasure to turn the mic over to him and to learn more about political civility tonight. So please welcome our lecturer, Dr. Lee Trepanier.
Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. Before I start, I just want to take a moment to thank Dr. Ben Gross for inviting me here tonight, as well as Jackson State University for hosting this event. I also want to take a moment to thank the Alabama Humanities Alliance and the Jack Miller Center for sponsoring this event and the Tocqueville series. And I just want to add that especially good chapter was in that book was by Dr. Gross on Rousseau. So it's worth looking into. Tonight, the talk is going to be about political civility. What is political civility? And I thought one way to open the talk would be to provide three scenarios. So scenario number one, a controversial public intellectual has been invited to speak on campus. His views are so controversial that they upset students, and students have complained to campus administrators. The campus administrators also agree with the students, disagreeing with the speaker's view. The students want to protest the speaker's event. After much deliberation, the campus administrators that the speaker will be allowed to speak on campus and protests will not be permitted because the event is optional. It's not mandatory. Students aren't required to attend this. Is this civility? I would say no. This is instead an example of toleration. Scenario number 2. The same speaker with the same controversial views goes to another campus. Students likewise are upset about the speaker's views and they want to protest, and they convey this to the campus administrators. The campus administrators also agree with the students' views. But this time, the campus administrators allow the students to protest as long as they do it civilly. That is to say, while the speaker is giving his presentation, they can protest by silently standing up or holding signs, but they can't actually disrupt the talk itself. Is this an example of civility? Again, I would say no. This is an example of respect. Third scenario. Same speaker again, same controversial views, different campus, students are upset. Students complain to the campus administrators. This time, the campus administrators cancel the speaker's invitation. Is this an example of civility? I would say no. This is an example of what I would call acceptance. So this raises, of course, the question, what is political civility? When we use the word political civility or civility, we often conflate it with the ideas of tolerance, respect, and acceptance. These terms are often used interchangeably with one another, and therefore it only confuses as opposed to clarify what civility is. So what I hope to do tonight is first talk about what is political civility. I'm going to present 3 definitions of political civility. First will be Teresa Bejan's definition of political civility in her book, Mere Civility. Second definition of civility will be Anne Hartel's book, it just came out last year, What Happened to Civility. And then third, Edward Shield's definition of civility, the virtue of civility. And as will be shown later in the presentation, I think Shield's definition of civility is the superior one to Bejan's and Hartel's. After we define what civility is, I want to take a brief tour to explain that civility as a concept actually has a long history in Western civilization, going back to the Greeks and Christians. And then finally, the final third of the talk, I want to compare civility to the ideas of toleration, respect, acceptance, and how civility is actually a superior virtue to these 3, and it's actually most suitable for a pluralistic democracy. So that's sort of the nature of the talk, as it were. So first of all, what is civility? Well, we start with Teresa Bejan's definition, the first definition of civility. In her book, Mere Civility, she looks at the 17th century New England Puritan Roger Williams. Roger Williams calls civility a low but solid virtue. That is, what civility is to keep the conversation going, to be committed to keep on talking with other people. It doesn't matter how much you disagree with that person, and in that disagreement, it may include things like invectives, insults, but no matter how tasteful that conversation is, it has to be continuing nonetheless. Why does he hold this position? Well, Williams holds this position because he's opposed to the religious speech codes of his time in 17th century America. So for example, in 1669, the Constitution of the Carolinas held that a person could not criticize religion or a church or a clergyman. If you did so, you would be punished by the law. Williams was opposed to this. He believes that you should be able to insult religion, the church, and clergymen. As long as you were committed to keeping the conversation going forward, it didn't matter how distasteful it was. So civility in this way is a low virtue, but it also required people to have thick skins. You have to be willing to have your views to be insulted and criticized. Okay, so this sounds very fine in terms of a definition of civility, a low and solid virtue, keeping the conversation going, being subject to insults and criticism. But I think for today, it's probably not really suitable, especially on university campuses. University campuses have speech codes. We tend to prohibit things like hate speech for good reasons. And so the call for having thick skins to deal with insults and invectives can seem as a type, at best, of microaggression, and at worst, a type of hate speech. So I think there's Bejan's definition of civility is problematic in that way. The second account of civility I want to look at is Anne Hartel's account, which is in her book, What Happened to Civility? Just came out last year. And in her book, she argues that civility is a social construct. It's artificial, right? And therefore, because it's artificial, as a social construct, it is doomed to failure. She cites Michel de Montaigne, the 16th century French philosopher, as the originator of civility. And in her argument, her argument goes like this, essentially. Montaigne argues that human beings in the modern world should no longer look to Christianity to give them meaning in their lives. They should no longer look to Christianity to give themselves their morality. Instead, individuals should decide for themselves, for himself or herself, what it means to be happy, what it means to be good, what it means to be moral, right? But in this world, in this modern world, where everyone gets to decide for himself or herself what is good, what is moral, what it means to be happy, what holds society together? According to Montaigne, what holds society together is civility. It's a social glue that keeps society together, where people are pursuing different ends that may be even contrary to one another. Now, according to Hartel, this type of civility does have a moral character, but this moral character is derived from Christianity. So things that Montaigne would consider civil would be such things like open-mindedness or honesty or generosity. The problem she sees with this definition, with this view of civility, is that because civility has a moral character, and this moral character is, the source of this moral character is rooted in Christianity, it's ultimately doomed to failure. Why is it doomed to failure? Because if every individual can decide for himself or herself what the good life is, they can reject Christianity in itself, and Christianity as a social force will decline. And therefore, the original moral source of civility will disappear likewise. In fact, she argues that today, society has degraded to such an extent that to repair civility is impossible. Right? And the only way out of this path is if, according to her, if we sort of make religion, if we elevate religion in the public square, if we sort of return to religion has a prominent role in giving us our morality, then thereby civility might be restored. Now, whether you agree or disagree with her on this argument and this account and her interpretation of Montaigne, I think there's some problems with it. First, is it possible that religion could ever become a social force in America again? The last 50 years have shown a steady decline of religious attendance in this country, and there's nothing to suggest that that's going to be reversed anytime soon. It's probably unlikely. Second, even if it was possible that religion could become a prominent social force in American life, it may not be desirable. If you have a particular religion, let's say Christianity, becomes a prominent social force in American life, by definition, it's going to have an exclusionary character. It's going to exclude people who are non-Christian from the public square. And this seems to be at odds with our definition of what it means to be a healthy democratic society. So I looked at Bijan's definition, which I think has some problems. And I looked at Hartel's definition, which I think also has some problems. The third definition of civility is Edward Shields in his book, The Virtue of Civility. And in this book, he defines civility as follows. It is self-command, controlling one's passion so we can engage in reasoned deliberation. We can engage in reasoned conversation with people with whom we disagree. So it's command of our passions or self-command to engage in reasoned conversation with people with whom we disagree. It also includes pursuing our own interests and balancing pursuing our own interests with the interests of the common good. So a sort of complete definition of his account of civility would be, civility is the self-command for the sake of reasoned deliberation for individual interest and the common good. I think this definition in some ways is a superior account of civility than what you find in Bijan and Hartel's. It's superior to Bijan's definition because it does not allow insults and invectives against people. right? If we are engaged in reasoned conversation, we can disagree with one another, but we have to do so rationally, right? Not emotionally. And I also think it's a superior definition compared to Hartel's definition, because Schills argues that it's part of human nature. This is not a social construct. So because it's part of human nature, it's a permanent condition that we have. So that's sort of a quick review of the three definitions of what is civility and why I think Schill's definition of civility is the best account for democracy. Next part of the speech I want to look into is the history of civility. And this is really going against Hartel, who argues that civility was formed in the 16th century and it's a social construct. I don't think that's true. If we look at civility, I would argue it has a long history in the Western tradition. So for example, if you read Plato's Protagoras, in that dialogue, he talks about that civilization has two components, eidos and dike. Eidos is sometimes translated today as honor. What is our social position in society, and what are the obligations that flow from that? And dike is often translated as justice. What's the common good for society? And in this dialogue, they talk about you need both eidos or honor and justice, dike, to have a civilization. Civility draws from both of it, right? Civility is a type of honor where we're pursuing our own interests. And it's also looking for the common good. It is a type of justice as well. And this sort of comports with Schill's definition. If you look at Aristotle as another example, Aristotle's definition is to be a virtuous person is what? Control the passions and to engage in reason and to live in a community of other people, even with people with whom you disagree with. And then finally, if you look at someone like Thomas Aquinas, who would argue that Aquinas doesn't really talk about civility explicitly, but he does talk about the Christian virtue of humility. Humility is the willingness to listen to other people. And why do we have to be humble? According to Aquinas, because human beings suffer from original sin. They are imperfect creatures. And because they're imperfect creatures, they will have imperfect knowledge. And as a result, they need to what? Talk to other people, listen to other people, give people the benefit of the doubt, and try to learn from them, have their viewpoint changed. So I think if you look from Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, and others, you see that civility has a long tradition in Western civilization, and it's very different than I would think what someone like Hartel claims, which is sort of a modern invention in that way. So then finally, the third part of this presentation is civility itself and how is it different and superior to our contemporary virtues of tolerance, respect, and acceptance. Its civility is self-command of reasoned deliberation for our own individual goals and the common good. The toleration is to put up with other people's beliefs, actions, and practices as long as it's not prohibited by law. So let me give you an example to sort of illustrate what toleration might look like. You have two neighbors. One's an Episcopalian and one's a Baptist, for argument's sake. The Episcopalian goes to his church and they teach that gay marriage is Christian. The Baptist goes to his church and they say gay marriage is sinful. Okay, they have obviously different belief systems, but neither belief is what? Prohibited by law. But because their belief systems are so different from each other, as neighbors, they what? Don't socially interact. They live side by side, they live peacefully with one another, but they don't know each other because of their religious differences. That is an example of toleration. Okay? We put up with other people's beliefs as long as they're not prohibited by law. And when we say prohibited by law, we're usually referring to John Stuart Mill's no harm principle in that way. Now, where does civility come in and how is that different than tolerance? Let's say across the street, you have a Mormon neighbor come in, and the Mormon neighbor believes in civility. So what he does is he invites both the Episcopalian and the Baptist over for dinner. Even though the three of them can't agree on their religious beliefs, the Mormon makes a point of not talking about them, instead try to compromise and talk about other matters. And he does this out of the virtue of neighborliness, or what we would call civility in this way. So what you see here is that civility, I would argue, is superior to tolerance in that it requires people to socially interact with others with whom you disagree with. It provides a social lubricant for society to manage itself and get along with people. And by the fact that you are talking with people with whom you disagree with, it affords that person a type of dignity. I respect you so enough, I respect you as a human being that I want to listen to your viewpoints, even though I may disagree with them. Right? What you don't find in toleration. Toleration is basically a type of stalemate for civil peace, a type of benign neglect, whereas civility is trying to socially interact with people to create a common good. Let's find the commonalities. Let's find the areas where we do share commonalities, and the areas that we don't, we can agree to disagree in that way. So that's the difference between toleration and civility. Let's compare civility to respect. Respect is having behavior endorse or affirmatively accept the practices, beliefs of other people with whom you disagree with. So if toleration is, I'm not going to socially interact with that person. Respect is, my behavior is going to endorse that person. So let's give another example. A Catholic priest tolerates gay marriage because it's legal, right? But he's not going to respect it. He's not going to go to a ceremony of gay marriage. He's going to stay away from that. That would be an example of toleration. By contrast, let's say in terms of respect, let's say you have a Silicon Valley executive. Now, the Silicon Valley executive privately is opposed to gay marriage, right? But as CEO of his company, he makes public statements on behalf of his company in support of gay marriage. He also, on behalf of his company, donates money to gay organizations. This would be an example of respect. That would be the difference between the two, hopefully, tolerance and respect. Now, how did respect emerge in the United States? It really emerged in the 1960s when, with a new left. And the new left was trying to, new left saw tolerance as an outdated virtue. And they said they wanted to instead have respect as a way to have social justice be realized in the United States, particularly giving what women and other minorities civil rights. Okay, so what we do is we can't just sort of benignly neglect people. We need to change people's behavior so we can endorse or accept other people's value systems that we may disagree with. Now, this may sound interesting, but the problem is what happens is that over time, respect is not seen as enough. Right? Respect is seen as a type of hypocrisy. It's a gap between one's actions and one's beliefs. So if we look at going back to the Silicon Valley executive example, let's say his private conversations of being opposed to gay marriage comes out in the public. Well, his previous statements on behalf of the company in support of gay marriage and his donations to gay organizations is going to be seen as what? Hypocritical and deceitful and insincere, right? And this leads us to our fourth sort of modern virtue, acceptance. What is required now is not to change one's behavior, but to change one's behavior and one's beliefs to accept it. Okay. And that's sort of where we are today in many ways, is to accept other people's beliefs. So I'll give you another example to sort of illustrate this. Let's say you have the Mormon again. He holds a fundraiser at his church. Fundraiser for, I don't know, helping poor children or whatever cause it may be. His Catholic neighbor, out of respect, changing his behavior, he goes to the Mormon fundraiser, to the Mormon church, donates money to it, participates in the fundraiser. Even though the Mormon and the Catholic have different beliefs about religion, he respects the Mormon by going to it, the fundraiser, and giving money. Acceptance would suggest that his behavior is not enough. Acceptance would be that he would actually have to convert to Mormonism. He could not offer resistance to Salt Lake City, right? Acceptance is to change a person's belief system. It is, as one of my colleagues put it to me recently, your conscious, right? Your internal beliefs, your conscious is not sacred anymore. Your conscious now is just bigoted and it needs to be woke. That is what acceptance is in many ways. We see this today where you have the event of cancel culture, online shaming, and woke ideology. This is all being funneled by acceptance. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. That's for you to decide. I'm just trying to provide a conceptual clarity behind this. So that's the difference between acceptance to respect, toleration, and civility. So let me just conclude by talking about these four virtues. I think civility, as defined by self-command and reasoned deliberation for individual in the pursuit of individual goals and the common good, is superior to tolerance, respect, and acceptance. I think there's something good to be said for tolerance, respect, and acceptance too, but I think civility is superior to them. Why? With respect to tolerance, I think civility requires people to socially interact with people with whom you disagree. You afford that person a type of dignity, and it makes it possible, and by trying to find commonalities, it makes possible the common good in society. I think also civility, because it's voluntary, is different and superior to respect and acceptance because there's no coercion being required. You're not being forced to change your behavior or your belief system. So in this way, I think civility is the most suitable for a pluralistic, diverse, and vibrant democracy. Yes, there may be places for respect, there may be places for acceptance, there may be places for tolerance, but as a whole, society as a whole, political civility is probably the best way forward to get past our differences. So let me just say in conclusion, even though civility is it's a middle virtue, it's not like courage or wisdom, it's not very aspirational. It's a middle virtue, it's a middle-aged virtue, but in some ways, I think it's superior to what you find in tolerance, respect, and acceptance, because what those virtues can't do, civility can, which is to make political friends out of strangers. Thank you very much for listening tonight, and I think we have a Q&A. Is that right? And you could be either civil or tolerant or simple or accepting.
I'll start here with the in-house audience. And if you don't mind using the microphone, that way the people online, we have about 50 people. That way they can hear your question too.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the idea or the relationship between civility and passion, because it almost seemed like those cannot coexist. But maybe I misunderstood.
No, I think that's a great question, and I really didn't touch upon that. So I think it's worthy to clarify that. Certainly, there's a role of passion involved. If we're using Edward Shill's definition in that, but the passion is still passion doesn't lead to social interaction with someone with whom you disagree. It's reason that you're interacting with someone through rational deliberation. You can have passion as a motivation behind that, but it's not the primary way where you interact with someone. That would be different than, say, someone like with Bejan's definition, which is very passionate, right? I'm so passionate that I'm going to call you all sorts of hateful things, right? That's not reasonable. That's passionate, or passion dominates reason in that way. So I think there is a place for passion in Edward Shill's definition of civility, but it's secondary to reason in that way. It's a great question.
Other questions?
Sure. I know tonight you had everything, but you spoke about Western civilizations, and do you think that if we took the Western religions out, are Eastern religions or Eastern civilizations, are they more civil, do you think?
Oh, that's a tough one. So
You can bow out. I mean, that's fair.
my expertise is in Western civilization. I wouldn't want to try to claim certain expertise on Eastern civilization or Islamic civilization. My sense, though, I'll just offer some preliminary thoughts for what they may be worth. I think one of the differences you find, say, in the Eastern civilization, Islamic civilization, is that they are shame-based cultures. And so it's based on your behavior. And so there's a lot of sort of social pressure on your behavior conforming in such a way to be civil, for lack of a better word. Where in the West, we do have some of a shame-based culture, but mostly a guilt culture, interior to ourselves. And so in some ways, in the West, we have to deal with both shame and guilt. I think what's happened today is that shame has almost completely disappeared. That may be good or be bad. That's for you to decide yourself. But when you have a pluralistic democracy where everyone can sort of decide what's the good life for me, right? The flip side of that is what I don't care what you think about my pursuit of life, right? Whether it's shameful or not. So shame is no longer really a social glue. It's a type of sort of conscious or guilt that holds Western civilization together today. So I think that probably one way to think about the difference between East and West. But again, I'm not an expert in Eastern civilization, so I'm thinking I should better stop here before I get too much.
Understand.
I have a little bit closer. I have a question. I think I have to kind of set it up. First, you talked a lot about religion. You mentioned like kind of as a basis for civility in some cases, at least in some of your definitions.
I'll use them as examples.
Examples, yes. And then you gave an example of the gay marriage, and I think it was with acceptance or one of those values, right? It was housed within what was acceptable by the law, right? And so if you go back 50 years, that example that you gave would not hold anymore.
Correct.
So thinking back to some of the historical context that you used to set up the definition for civility, I wonder if you couldn't speak to how, like, temporal change of civility over time. Is this a steady course where the balance of civility is fixed, or is there variation among that as our values change over time?
Right. So I think that's a great question.
Is it like a turbulent path forward at times?
So yeah, that's a great question. I'll just add before I answer that, the caveat that I was just using religion as an example because we're in the South. It's a religious part of the country. I thought this would be good. If we were in the Northeast, I would talk about Marxism or something. But in terms of, I think if we use, in terms of what constitutes civility, this civility is a constant or does it change over time? I think that's sort of basic the question.
You're really looking at the adjustment of civility. Like if you look at political discourse today, I don't know, is that a part of kind of achieving this steady state of civility that we want to achieve, or are people just totally off base right now?
Yeah. So I think the short answer would be probably is that civility, if we use Schill's definition of civility, which is reasoned deliberation of what we can agree upon as a society, that will obviously change over time, right? Because as circumstances change in society, what we reasoned over time is also going to change over time as well. So for example, the welfare state, today, we take it for granted. 100 years ago, it was not. But through reasoned deliberation, which is also passionate, we come to agree that this is needed for a vibrant democracy in that way. So I agree with you. What are the parameters of civility will change over time as long as we have sort of we reason these arguments out among ourselves in that way. In terms of, there's another part of, I was going to mention, but it escapes me at the moment. I can't remember, but so it's not fixed in that regard, right? The parameter of civility is not fixed. It would just change. But I think when we talk about change, how does it change? Is it change sort of suddenly and emotionally or passionately, or is it changed by sort of rational deliberation? That would be the question I would ask. So let me give it. Now I remember. Let me give you an example. I think one of the concerns, I'm not taking a position on this one way or the other, but one of the concerns today, say on college campuses, is canceling people, right? For whatever reason it may be. And it probably may be the case that some people probably deserve to be canceled. I'm not categorically opposed to it, but why are we canceling people? Are we canceling people because after rational deliberation, they'd be like, oh, yes, we've gone through this person's statements and writings and records, and we see, yes, this person has views that are outside the bounds of democratic discourse, white supremacy, for example, right? Or are we canceling people because they made one statement which we take out of context and we just for whatever reason don't like it, we're going to cancel that? That's sort of passion or emotionally driven, right? So there's a difference, I think, on what constitutes civility versus what constitutes acceptance. And I think we have a hard time today trying to distinguish those differences. Certainly the white supremacists, I think, hopefully, we all agree should be canceled on a college campus. So someone who may hold, I don't know, libertarian view that's not racist, maybe that person should be able to speak on campus and not be canceled in that way, right? And the reason, how do we make that difference? Is it because we're emotionally driven or passionately driven, or are we using reasoned deliberation in that way? So I think it varies in that sense. Now, with respect to the political discourse part of your question, clearly political discourse has coarsened over time. Some people say this is a bad thing, some say this is a good thing. There are debates on both sides of that. But I think one thing that's really interesting that hasn't really been thought through, and I haven't thought through either, is the role of technology. Now where we have instantaneous communication, right? And when you have instantaneous communication, whether it's on Twitter or other forms of social media, the result is what? Not to react rationally or in a reasoned, deliberate sort of way. Your reaction when you see something on Twitter is to what? Be very passionate and write something very insulting and invective. So I think in some ways technology sort of accelerates or taps into our parts of human nature that are sort of contrary to civility in that regard. So that's sort of a long-winded answer. I don't know if I addressed the question or not.
Yeah, I don't know either. But yeah, it's giving me stuff to think about. And I'm thinking of more of, I guess it's a scale thing instead of individual civility, like societal civility, and there are bounds of what is acceptable. And so as those bounds adjust, like how does that play out in the real world? And I guess that fits with the examples that you gave of, social media and all this stuff. That is, the bounds are adjusting themselves.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's going to be negotiation between what the courts and political institutions. It's going to be negotiation between companies and people and interest groups. And it's going to take some time, and that's the nature of democracy. Especially democracy, our scale of our size and the diversity it is, it's going to take a lot of groups to sort of hash these things out, and hopefully we'll come to some sort of consensus. Maybe we won't, but some sort of parameters of stability over time. I think technology really is interject something new that we haven't experienced before. We sort of instantaneous communication. Where before, if you wanted to sort of, I don't know, express your opinion, you would write an editorial. And that, of course, will be curated by the newspaper. It would take time, and then the person would respond. And they couldn't respond right away, but they would have to sit down and write the response to it. Today you don't have to. Right? You just need a internet connection and a keyboard. a phone. You're in, and you can do it.
So I see a lot of, similar to what you were saying about the difference between working at the sort of governmental level or a large scale level versus individuals. So, reasoned arguments and whatnot take you so far, but when there is, a shift in a cultural belief system of this is right behavior, then forcing acceptance is what you're trying to do. So like school desegregation, there were arguments back and forth for years. And finally, the federal government just said, no, this is going to happen. And what happens is that once you desegregate and people start sending their kids to integrated schools, then they start to self-reflect, and self-perception theory would say that then they look at themselves and say, well, I'm letting my kids go to school with minority students, so I guess it's not so bad. So, and then they change their belief system based on their perceptions of their own actions. And so it's not necessarily always reasoned discourse that gets you to the answer that you want in society. It's often forcing people to do the things that they didn't want. I mean, it's the same thing with gay marriage. When you look at the polls before gay marriage was made legal, and you have both sides saying it's, good and bad, and then you make it legal, and then people realize civilization didn't collapse, the world didn't end, I guess it's okay. And so you saw a chunk of people that then switched their opinion as a result of that, forced acceptance of that moral value in society. So it's like, I see civility as good when you're talking about how should you interact with other people, but then when your group decides this is going to be what we're going to accept in society, then you can't reason with everybody to get them to your position. Sometimes it requires legislation or pushing them or making it to be, politically correct or unacceptable to say the opposite position because of the common good. So yeah, I have a hard time, and I don't know if that's when you were saying sometimes respect and acceptance are, valued, but I see that as being important in our society. And like Clara said, it's, I do see the passion side too, because I don't necessarily see that reasoned debate is always superior to emotional input. That I disagree with Plato about that. I'm an emotion researcher. I study guilt and shame. So I just still am mad at Plato for saying that reason should be above emotion and making emotion disappear for 2,000 years of, philosophy.
Yeah, a lot to answer for. So just a few thoughts to that. First of all, thank you for that insightful comment. I would say first, sort of initial glib comment would be, well, what happens is that what we found in this country is when you had desegregation, it's not as if the white parents said, oh, this is great, my white children are going to now reflect and learn from minorities. What do they do? We're going to go to our own school district and to have basically have a different type of segregation in a different sort of way, right? If you look at school racial integration today, it's actually worse than it was in the 1950s. So parents actually, you have white flight in that way. But I do think you have a point, which is when you have sort of rational deliberation or reason agreement, it has to be supported with force or coercion to some extent, right? I mean, that otherwise it won't have any effect on society. So I think we're in agreement with that. The question, I guess, is what is better to have? What is preferable to have coercion in society? Is it under the guise of civility, or is it under the guise of tolerance, respect, or acceptance? I think that's where we would probably differ in that regard. And then the final point I would make is that if you actually look at, say, desegregation, for example, and even gay marriage, but let's say with desegregation, you find that there was over time, it's a long period of time, that there was rational deliberation to change the laws and argue that desegregation was unconstitutional, right? So everyone knows Brown v. Board of Education, but everyone forgets all the civil rights cases from the 1870s to the 1930s. So there's a long series of time where you had legislation, court decisions, rational deliberation, and eventually, through Brown v. Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act, you had a new consensus or new civility in society that was supported by coercion from the federal government. So it is longer over a long, if you get a longer perspective, you do see it happening. I think you see something happening, you make a similar argument, I think, with gay marriage to some extent as well. So I think we in some ways we're probably more in agreement than disagreement in that regard. It's probably my fault, probably not clarifying that in the presentation.
I may be confused, but what I'm seeing here, please correct me if I'm wrong, what you're giving here is a definition of civility as a general thing. What the content of what civility applies to, or how it may apply, is contextual.
Yes.
It depends entirely on the circumstances of what the issues are, what the social mores are at that point in time. Let me give an example to sort of test this out. Right now, we're having some laws passed in states that are outlawing instruction in diversity. And maybe those laws are good. However, if we ban the discussion of certain situations, whatever they may happen to be, we've cut off the ability to be able to apply civility, because there is no opportunity for reasoned deliberation. Let me pose another example here to see if I'm going the right direction here. I don't think many people here would question that the practices of the Nazi regime in World War II, in the Holocaust, are unacceptable by any standards. However, under these laws banning the controversial topics, it would be impossible to discuss those things because they would upset somebody. So basically, civility in that case, again, doesn't apply simply because it's taken off the table.
Yeah, it's not possible.
It's not possible. Okay. And I guess if I'm understanding this correctly, then you have to look at civility as a possibility in the context of whatever the circumstances are of the content.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So I think I agree with that. I think it's probably better summed up than I presented in a lot of ways. I would just say, it's probably one of the few times, maybe, I don't know. I'm a transplant here, so forgive me, but probably one of the few times that, probably thankful that you're in Alabama and not Florida. I don't know. Is that too much? No, but I think you're right. Civility, the supposition for civility to be practiced is that it requires a type of maximum openness of discussion in that way, right? Because as you said, if you close off certain topics, you really can't be civil. If you can't rationally deliberate about certain topics, you really can't be civil.
Just jump in real quick. So civility has less to do with, I'm going to say something that may offend you, but my offense to you doesn't matter in the civility because you took offense to it. It's reasoned, it's deliberate, it's seeking the truth. This is what I'm working for. And so even though you're offended, doesn't mean that my statement wasn't civil.
I would say,
I mean, I think.
yeah, I just would qualify that in two ways. One, obviously, reason deliberation, but for lack of a better word, tone or style does matter, right? So if one can sort of reason in a more inviting way, as opposed to other people can reason in a very sort of aggressive way and turn people off. So a lot of it depends if you're trying to persuade someone or not, as opposed to just to win the argument. The other thing I would mention, when you say pursuing the truth, I would change that to I'm pursuing my individual end, but I'm also balancing that individual end with the common good of society. And so that's going to sort of temper my argumentation, right? It's not just, here's my reason argument, and I'm going to win because I want X. Right? Civility would say, here's my reason argument, I want X, but I also want the common good. And so I might have to adjust and modify it and make it more inviting for you to see my perspective and be persuaded by that. Does that make sense, or maybe not?
I don't know that I agree.
Yeah, no, that's
Does not civility necessitate humility, which is a Christian virtue?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. It does. I mean, civility does suggest that there is every person has a.
Where does this idea of human dignity come from? What is the origin of this idea of human dignity?
That's a long and complex. Certainly, there's a Jewish Christian tradition that plays into it. Certainly, there's Greek and Roman philosophy plays into the idea of human dignity as well. But in terms of humility, I think that you're exactly right. Is that no one has comprehensive knowledge, right? And because we're all deficient in knowledge, we therefore all need to learn from each other. And it does require a type of humility about in that to engage civility. So I would agree 100%.
Get a couple questions from the online audience. We'll come back to the in-house audience. Stephanie asks, the word civility derives from Latin, I'm sure you're aware of, which denotes the state of being a citizen and hence good citizenship. In your view, can you speak more explicitly about how you think civility relates to good citizenship? What role does or should civility play in being a good citizen in a liberal democracy?
That's a great question. I would say when I talk about the common good, I think that's really sort of the political perspective of citizenship for civility, is that we need to balance our individual goals with the goods of the common good of society. And that may require us to temper it, what our individual pursuits are, and for the good of society. It also requires us, I think, to engage in a manner, to socially engage with people in public in a way that's not offensive, but inviting, right? In a democracy, also it's based on the idea of what? Consensus, whether it's majority vote or however it's defined. And the only way that can happen is through persuasion, through getting people to agree with your perspective. So in terms of citizenship, it requires a type of public discourse where it's not aggressive but inviting. And I think that's something that's often lacking in today's political discourse.
Wonderful. Thank you. Tashawn asks, when you use the example of a controversial speaker on a college campus,
Not me.
the example of a racist or a supremacist came to my mind, like the anti-Semitic crowds in Charlotte a few years ago. I think Charlottesville. How reasonable is it to expect someone to engage civilly with someone who does not believe in the humanity or right to exist of the other party?
Well, I think we addressed that somewhat earlier, some of the earlier questions. I think, it's rational deliberation that what society agrees upon certain parameters. So if you get to a point where I think we have in our democracy that certainly anti-Semitic or racist viewpoints should not be permitted in the public square, and they should be banished from that. So I think, yeah, that's obviously a negotiation that takes over time between various institutions and interest groups of people.
Dennis asks, thank you for sharing your insights. Where would you say do some of the rather negative facets of political speech, like lampooning, exaggerating, insulting, fall within the concept of political civility?
That's difficult. That's a tough one. What you're really talking about is political humor, right? And what the real political it's really there's really no good either conceptual definition or sort of way to sort of say this is acceptable political humor and this is not acceptable political humor. That is a tough one. It's something I've thought about quite a lot. I haven't come to any sort of resolution on that. Part of it, I think, has to do with context, right, and the time. And so, what may be sort of politically acceptable at one period may not be politically accepted in another period. But how that's negotiated is really, really tough. I don't, quite frankly, have a good answer to that question.
I'll take one more from the online before returning to in-house. But Paul asks, in a world with alternative facts, how does one stay civil?
That's a great question. I think in terms of practicality, what I tell my students is try to obtain their news or their facts from a variety of sources. And so both from, say, the political left and the political right, and try to spread a net as wide as possible in terms of information gathering. A lot of it, so that's sort of a practical way. In terms of sort of more conceptually, that really deals with a question of education. How do we civic education? How do we educate our citizenship in that way? And how do we cultivate a type of reason where they can distinguish fact from fake news? And that's a longer conversation, but I think that's sort of the approach that we need to take in the United States. I will say, on a hopeful note, you do see a renewal of this in the United States, really in the last 5 years. I think I know in my field, political science, there's been a lot of civic education renewal projects happening, both in terms of scholarship and on the ground and teaching. You see it also with nonprofit organizations that are trying to get people from different communities to force them to talk to one another. So I think it is being recognized in the United States at all levels, and there's action being taken. I'm trying to educate people to do that, but it's going to take time.
Hi, I've enjoyed your talk tonight. To this gentleman's point over here, he said that humility is often attributed with civility, and that's often thought of as a Christian value due to the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament. But I think also some would argue that humility is not just sanctioned off in terms of Christianity. I think some would say other religions also practice humility. And to your point that you said sort of to the start of this, with religion on the decline, do you think we will reach a threshold where sort of a vacuum is created, where so many people have walked away from religion that now there is sort of a search and sort of a scramble for people to try to find a reason for their civility?
I think we're at that moment right now, quite frankly. So I think according to the latest polling, only 63% of Americans consider themselves Christian. It's the lowest point in our country's history. So, and you could say it may be correlated, it may not be correlated with the rise of sort of political polarization and the coarsening of public discourse. in terms of the question of, yes, humility is not exclusively linked to Christianity. It's obviously other religions. It can also be seen as,
But that's where it comes from, the West, and we were talking about the West.
yeah, well, it's certainly one of the sources.
Julius Caesar was not humble.
That's true. That's true. So it is, you know, it's. Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting today, if you, the Templeton Foundation, for example, one of their big projects is on intellectual humility. They funded millions of dollars on this. It's an approach that I don't find particularly interesting because it's very quantitative and they want to measure everything. But it is, I think, you know, that's what the research will bear. Will be very interesting to see. Can you have a type of humility that's not rooted in religion, but rooted in something else? Maybe it's sentiment, maybe it's a type of reason, and who knows? But that, if you're sort of interested in the question of intellectual humility, I would look at the Templeton research on that.
My question was about the relationship between, how do I want to put this? Rights discourse and responsibility discourse.
Okay.
How do you have civility in a society that has a rights discourse, but as far as I can see, no responsibility discourse?
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem. I think part of it is the responsibility discourse probably needs to be resurrected in our society. I think civility might be a way to do this, right? If we're focusing, right? If civility is just focusing on your own individual goals, that's sort of akin to what a right discourse is. But if it's also balanced against the common good of society, that's a responsibility discourse. So civility in some ways can be a sort of a remedy or perhaps a way to bring responsibility discourse back into society. So I agree entirely.
Going back to what these gentlemen said about virtue coming from religion, do you believe that virtue comes from religion or religion stems from human virtue?
Really earning my well, there's certainly a great deal of academic debate of the chicken egg type of question. I think that depends. One could say, I guess, one way to perhaps approach it would be as follows: is what is human nature? Try to answer that question first. What is a human being? And then maybe a sub question to that would be: is there an innate spiritual component to human nature, which is manifested in religion? So depending upon how you answer that question, we'll probably address the question you raised.
We'll take just a couple more questions and then, yeah, we'll call it a night. But
Yes. So we've kind of bounced on this one back and forth a little bit tonight, but how can civility function in a society that's engrossed in identity politics, where when you disagree with someone's views, it equates to, you know, they take it personally as you don't see them as equals or as fellow human beings?
I think it's very difficult. And I think it varies from context to context. Okay, so we like to make blanket statements about, you know, this type of politics or that type of politics, but the reality is that we live in the world of particulars and contingencies. So you may have a case, for example, where someone says, I subscribe to identity politics, whatever it may be. And perhaps one way to think about it is, why does that person subscribe to that type of identity politics? Does that person do it out of a type of virtue signaling? Right? You know, I'm white, I'm privileged, I don't want my stuff taken away, so I'm going to claim identity politics. Right? Protect it. Is that person claiming it because they genuinely think through rational deliberation that this is part of who they are, and this informs their experience of their being? That being, say, for example, a minority, that there may be structural systemic factors in society that puts them at a disadvantage, and they see that, and it's impacted them deeply, and that and they see that as who they are. Right? Those are two very different scenarios. And so probably in the first case, you probably aren't able to engage that person civilly, right? But in the second case, maybe, right? Because that's obviously coming from the motivation of that identity politics is from a genuine encounter with their reality. And if you want to engage with that person civilly, you want to understand that person's perspective, their experiences, where they come from. Now, you may end up in disagreeing on fundamental issues, right? But you can do it in a reasoned way. So it's probably an answer you probably wasn't looking for, but I think it really depends on the context, because when we invoke things like identity politics, it's often blanketed. But I think the actual manifestation of it varies quite a bit.
My question is, when it comes to politicians, especially like I can give you an example of Paul Gosar, of Representative Gosar and the Representative Ocasio-Cortez, two individuals who've had a history of incivility with each other. With this definition of civility, is there a way for them to act in a more civil and legislative way?
I mean, there is, but the question is, how can you set incentives for them to do so? I think and that's a tough question, I think, and especially in our, this is maybe a little too political sciencey an answer, but because the party system has essentially collapsed in the United States, we have a weak party system. And so what you have is basically congressmen and senators act as basically as subcontractors. They basically raise their own money. They, okay, I'm going to be a Republican or I'm going to be a Democrat. And what happens is that the more outrageous I can be, the more incivil I can be, the more money I can raise, by upsetting people and doing so, and then getting elected and holding power and things of that sort. So you could argue, I would argue, structurally speaking, if you had a stronger party system where the party controlled the money, and they could say, okay, politician A, your public statements are out of bounds. You do that again, you're not getting money from the political party, right? And so I think it's the incentive structure of our political system is really right now is conducive to incivility, to inflated and passionate rhetoric that's not very helpful at all. But yeah, I mean, certainly politicians can, but the question is, are the incentives there for them to do so?
So in the name of civil discourse, I just want to make a statement. My first question was about time. So I'm thinking of like the temporal component of how this stuff develops. There seems to be some ideas that civility is kind of housed or based in religion. That's where it came from. I think that's completely wrong. I think that civility is probably just evolutionary advantageous. Throughout history, before Homo sapiens, the Homo erectus, all the hominids, it's just an advantage to be civil.
No, I'm not a scientist or a biologist, but I've read sort of in the newspapers, right? That is one of the theories, that evolution is actually based on social cooperation and competition. The idea of civility would support well with that. So I would agree. Yeah, and as far as civility, I would say it has multiple sources. Could be evolution. Part of it probably evolutionary. Part of it maybe social customs. Part of it maybe other facets.
What was I going to say? You look at societies that are officially atheistic.
Mm-hmm.
They're the most uncivil places on earth. Mao's China, Stalin's Russia, Nazi Germany. These are the most uncivil places in history. I just cannot accept the fact that there is no relationship between religion and civility.
In the Netherlands, very atheistic. And how uncivil are they?
But they still have a Protestant culture. They have a Protestant Christian culture.
So, no, I'm not in any way saying that there's no correlation between the two. What I'm saying is that certainly religion is a source of civility.
Oh, I'm not.
It's not the only source.
No.
So I think we would agree on that. Yeah. And if you want contemporary examples, North Korea.
Yes.
Is case number one.
I'm going to take one last question here from the online audience, and we'll call sort of last call. So if you got a question, throw it up, but we'll call last call because we're coming up close to that 7 o'clock hour here. So we had an anonymous attendee ask, when you were talking about political humor, you said the ideas of acceptable civility change according to times. Would you say, or what would you say is the driving factor? So I think what would you say is the driving factor behind these changes in ethics? And is this due to new and altering factors, or is there something else driving that?
Well, I think it's multifaceted. I think the factors that change society are multifaceted. Some of it's probably ideas, some of it's probably institutions, some of it's probably economics, some of it's technology. Some of it is just really type of demographics and demographic composition. So I think it's really hard to answer that question. I think there's an abundance of factors that sort of changes the parameters of civility over time. And so it's probably not the answer you're looking for, but it's probably the best I can do at the point. I don't think being anonymous is really civil. Maybe it is.
I think we have one last question here.
You put me on the spot for the last one.
I think I haven't seen any other hands come up, so I think this is
Okay. So I want to think carefully about how I want to phrase this. So with the political arena now being so heavily broadcasted, and the news media becoming such a dominant factor in how politics are played out, at least in my opinion, that's not what news was originally intended for. I don't think news was meant to be a 24-hour broadcasted thing, just in my opinion. But with news now playing such a huge role in how politics is played out, do you think, or let me rephrase that, how do you think someone should behave in the political arena when so many people are afraid of their words being put into a soundbite because the soundbite sounds better from a viewership ratings monetary perspective than their entire statement? How do you think civility should play out going forward with that?
Well, it's not for me to give political advice to politicians, but I would think that one thing to consider perhaps would be is for politicians to trust that the American public is probably more mature than they give them credit for, and to treat them as adults and to speak to them as adults. Maybe I'm being naive and optimistic, but that's maybe one approach to it. In terms of the news media, it's very tough. I mean, the history of the media in this country is profit, right? I mean, there's a great essay in this week's New Yorker about this sort of history of the history of the American media. And I think the title is "Why Do Americans Mistrust the Media?" And they argue it's primarily profit driven. It's not driven for common good or anything else. So the politicians' relationship with the media and the public relationship with the media is complicated because of that.
And this will be our last question here. I know.
This kind of goes back to what you were saying, Dakota. But when you're speaking about news media in America, how generally it's for profit, we look back in previous presidential debates where it was a lot more, dry, a lot more of just simple answers and policy decisions. Where you look back at the last 2020 election debates where it was simple, just back and forth quips, racking each other. How can, I guess, students of political science or just civil Americans, civilians remain civil when sensationalism in America is on a rise and is what is popular today?
Well, practically, what can I do as a student? I think is what you're asking. I think there's a few things. I think one is just being a good student. So show up to class, do the work, ask questions. But in all seriousness, I think it's worth studying these things. You have 4 years here to do that, study these questions deeply with your faculty members. I think it's also good to actually practice it, whether it's within the classroom or in student organizations or working with the community. And people when you disagree with, not always like-minded people, get out there and sort of challenge your beliefs in a civil sort of way. And then in terms of the larger sort of public, there's something, why not write an editorial or an essay for a public magazine? See, it maybe accept it may not be. Or if you don't like it, just create your own blog in that way, or wherever young people do today. And maybe also, if things that you find sort of extreme, don't subscribe and read them in that way. So I would say for young people, especially students, it's really a golden chance for you to be active, both in theory and practice, and to reflect on it and learn from it. Are you going to make mistakes? Of course, but that's the only way we really learn.
I want to thank Dr. Trepanier for being here tonight. So thank you again very much. I appreciate how we could be civil here. Plenty of hot topics, hot takes out there, but we remain civil through all of it. That's impressive. An hour of that, you don't see that everywhere anymore. So maybe this is a model. We'll put this on YouTube, right? And somebody will find that and see a model of civility, and who knows. I hope you can join us again in the future. We want to thank, of course, the Jack Miller Center and Alabama Humanities Alliance for sponsoring tonight's lecture. We'll be back on Wednesday, March 1st, 5:30 p.m. We'll do a virtual only presentation with Dr. Emma Rodman. She's going to be presenting on the idea that the Declaration of Independence is an inegalitarian equality, or an inegalitarian equality. So it'll be an interesting idea, I think, and worthy for people to join in. So that'll be 5:30 Central on Wednesday, March 1st via Zoom. You can follow us on Facebook or follow us on YouTube and join our listserv to get that invite. Thank you for coming. Thank you again for Dr. Trepanier for presenting. And I hope everyone has a great night. Bye.
LJ.